I am glad to be with you to here today. So let me start by making a short introduction, both of myself as well as the training module. So this PowerPoint presentation was developed by Joe LaRose, who was an extension specialist at the University of Missouri in 2020. And funding for this has been provided by the Walton Family Foundation. A little bit about myself. My name is Alan Weber. I actually work full-time. I'm a partner with a small firm based here in Missouri by the name of Mark IV. We specialize in working on bio-based products, but I also farm in central Missouri. So our farm is located about 85 miles east of Kansas City and just a little bit south of Interstate 70. So Interstate 70 pretty much connects St. Louis and Kansas City, and we're about halfway in between a diversified crop and livestock farm. So I primarily work with the crops and the cover crops. My father still runs the cow-calf operation, and so we work on both of those together. We're a more, what I would say, traditional corn-soybean rotation at this point in time. Historically, though, we've made use of a lot of other crops in our rotation. So we have historically had quite a little bit of milo or grain sorghum in the rotation, as well as winter wheat. I grew oilseed sunflowers for about a decade, marketing those into the birdseed market, and have also grown some specialty crops under contract as well. From a livestock perspective, typically we're running 40 to 45 pairs, or a cow-calf operation. We've been as high as a little over 50 cows. Our ground is a lot of pasture and timber. We're a little bit less than half of our acres are row crops. So we do have some ground that's definitely more of a cow-calf operation. So I would describe our farm as rotational no-till. And what I mean by that is that I still have a vertical till tool, which I primarily make use of in the fall. So after corn harvest, we will actually run our stalks with a vertical till tool. And that is also the way that we typically seed our cover crops in terms of being able to get some seed to soil contact. And last thing, from a cover crop perspective, I've been using cover crops and also grazing cover crops since the early 2000s, and so have more than a decade of experience with using them. Just wanted to give you a little bit of perspective about our operation and how we use cover crops, as I think that you'll find that whenever we're looking at cover crops, they're really specific to the individual, to the farm, to the geography, and in terms of how they use those. So the topic for the day is grazing of cover crops. And from the last Census of Agriculture, we know that the use of cover crops has expanded significantly, at least on a percentage basis, up from 10 million acres to about 15 million acres. But that 15 million acres still only represents about 5% of U.S. cropland. So obviously there's still some holdback on the minds of producers in terms of using cover crops. I think from my perspective, a lot of times that comes down to the issues of labor at harvest, as well as the annual cost associated with the cover crops. And a lot of the benefits that we think about with cover crops are longer term in terms of nature. So, protecting soil, increasing soil aggregate stability, increasing soil organic matter, those benefits tend to accrue over time. And it's one of the reasons why that, in my opinion, grazing of cover crops is an excellent way, to be able to offset some of those annual costs which are associated with the planting of cover crops. From the livestock perspective, and this kind of depends upon, whether you're running some steers or heifers, more of a stockers or background operation versus having a cow-calf operation. But, for a second, let's just think of this from a cow-calf operator's perspective. If you're able to graze cover crops, you have this wonderful opportunity to put up less hay, or if you're purchasing hay, to buy less hay. Alternatively, you could view this as a perspective when you graze cover crops as a way to be able to expand your operation, or the number of cow-calf pairs that you can operate on a given acreage. There's also the opportunity to have a better quality, or higher forage quality in the spring versus that hay that you're feeding out in the rack. And finally, at least in our operation, when we come out of the winter and into the spring, and we get our cows and some of the cow-calf pairs onto grazing cover crops, they just look a lot better from a frame perspective, at least from my eyes. Now, I know that instead of grazing, you could also consider harvesting cover crops. But our focus today is gonna laser in on just of the grazing of cover crops. So I do have some experience in terms of putting up cereal rye as an example in terms of baleage, which turned out quite nice from my perspective. And I think that if I was doing it again, I could do even better in terms of the quality. There are some limitations there in the spring in terms of labor and how fast you have to be able to get that cover crop cut and then put into the baleage. I also know from speaking with quite a few producers, they've been very successful at putting up rilage, and a lot of them view that as a very cost-effective feedstuff. And so there are some opportunities there to be able to harvest cover crops. But I think it's important to keep in mind that when you're harvesting the cover crops and taking that biomass off the field, you're also removing nutrients. And that's one of those things that we obviously think of one of the benefits of using cover crops is that ability to be able to cycle nutrients. There's also the potential that as you remove that biomass that you're going to have less protection in terms of soil erosion. You also lose some of the benefits to the cash crop, which is following the cover crop. So for example, even whenever we are grazing cover crops on our farm, I'm very specific about not overgrazing that cover crop because I want a certain amount of residue left on that field to be able to no-till into, to be able to shade that soil, and to be able to limit evapotranspiration. And so when you're removing that cover crop through harvesting, you're giving up some of that benefit as well. And finally, just from the perspective of fertilization, whenever we're grazing, we're getting the manure spread throughout the fields. And whenever we're taking that off and not grazing, we're obviously not going to be able to have that benefit. Okay, so just in terms of getting started, my approach with grazing cover crops is actually very similar to my approach, an overall approach for using cover crops, and that is to start off very simple, gain experience, and then after you gain some experience to be able to adjust your management to be able to maximize the economics or to maximize the benefits. So starting simple in my mind could be as easy as renting out your field to another livestock producer, or it could be starting with one specific field where you maybe just graze it for a month or 6 weeks or something like that. After gaining experience, you may plant multiple fields and then rotate your cattle or sheep throughout those various fields. You may change the type of cover crop that you're using or planting to be able to maximize the forage quality. And then as you gain even more experience, it could lead to a scenario where you actually change your management operation on your farm. So something that I'll discuss in a little bit, which impacted our particular operation, is as we gained experience with using cover crops, we actually started to integrate in, we're typically plant 112 or 114-day corn on our farm, but we actually have started to integrate in some 102-day corn because of the fact that it allows us to be able to ensure that we get that corn harvested and we get a cover crop planted and we get some fall growth and some fall grazing from that. So after gaining that experience, from a basics perspective, a lot of the questions that I get revolve around fencing and water and also compaction issues. So when it comes to fencing, a lot of the questions, or maybe I should say concerns, seem to revolve around both costs as well as labor, which I'll term the hassle factor in terms of labor. Let me start by saying that additional fencing isn't always required. I'll give an example of our particular farm where just with the way that our farm is laid out, we have a lot of smaller fields. We have some interior fencing, which is still there, and it provides us the opportunity, or it provided us the opportunity to be able to start grazing cover crops without a lot of capital expense on the front side. If fencing is needed, then electric fencing is probably going to be your best and most affordable option. And even perimeter fencing or boundary fencing can still be electric, just using high tensile wire. It's still probably going to be cheaper than barbed or woven wire. And from our experience working with cattle, and I'm sure a lot of you as well, that you can get your cattle to the point where they're essentially trained and they know exactly what they're supposed to do in terms of respecting the electric wire, and then also whenever you're moving them between fields. So So water is kind of the same from my perspective, in the fact that whenever you're grazing cover crops, it doesn't always require a lot of extensive investments on the front end. Again, we're kind of lucky on our particular operation, where based upon the smaller field sizes, we either have a short access back to our watering tanks or watering features, or in some cases where we're moving them farther away, we actually still have some existing smaller ponds, which were legacies to the farm itself that we can utilize. If watering is required, you do have quite a few options. Portable water tanks, water wagons, these are all affordable options. If you think about it, when we're grazing cover crops in the spring, it's usually a fairly tight window. We just moved cows on in the middle of March, so we've only had about 3 weeks of grazing at this point in time. And unless you're planting green, you may have those cows off in another 3 to 4 weeks, something like that. So you've got a short window in which to be able to address the situation. If you're grazing in the fall over winter, the other obvious factor is that the water intake demand for your cattle are going to be a lot less. So from my perspective, both fencing as well as water are not limiting factors. You know, one of the common questions that I get when it comes to grazing cover crops, and I will tell you up front, it was also one of the questions and concerns that I had before starting to grazing, is compaction. And it's almost impossible, you know, not to have some hoof action in your fields. And sometimes if you're not careful, you know, especially with some rainy seasons, that can look pretty significant. However, quite a bit of work has been done to look at compaction from grazing as to whether or not it's an issue or not. Practical Farmers of Iowa actually just recently had a webinar series with one of them specific to looking at grazing and address some of the compaction issues, which I thought was great, because it was presented by an extension specialist from the University of Nebraska, where they overviewed this 16-year analysis from multiple sites. And their conclusions were comparing spring grazing versus fall grazing versus no grazing on cover crops, is that statistically there was essentially no difference in terms of bulk densities. I know from looking at other work that over time, where you build up the aggregate stability of the soil, you can actually get better water infiltration rates, and specifically with grazing as well. And spring grazing on that University of Nebraska work did note that the penetration rates were actually a little bit higher from spring grazing, but that any potential harm or impact was actually temporary in nature. There were also increases in terms of the soil microbial community with grazing, both spring and fall. And statistically, there was no difference as well in terms of the increase of soil organic matter. You know, and that's one of the things which I also think is important, as there's more and more of a focus now looking at the amount of carbon that we might be able to sequester on our farms through our practices, such as no-till, cover crops, et cetera. And so being able to demonstrate the fact that grazing, where we can pull that additional revenue stream, but have no statistical impact in terms of the buildup of soil organic matter, is pretty important, because, you know, statistically, roughly 60% of that organic matter is going to be soil organic carbon. So I think that's in terms of looking at your options for grazing and the concern about compaction. A couple of the things that I would note. One of them is that you could have a plan of action to be able to address. So, for example, if we know that we've got 4 or 5 days of rain that's coming, you know, one of the things that we will attempt to do is to pull them back into the feedlot and just, you know, put them back on some roughage and some hay, something like that, for a few days. I will tell you that at our operation, we found that leading cattle is a lot easier than driving cattle. So we kind of have them trained to be able to follow some breeder cubes or some range cubes. But if they have an option between grazing a cover crop in the spring versus being led away with a small treat like breeder cubes, you'll find it's actually kind of difficult to get them to want to come back into that feedlot. But that is one particular option. Another option that you could pursue is to have a sacrifice area or a sacrifice field in which you rotate them back to, just knowing they're going to have one field where you have more hoof action, et cetera. And then also you could potentially pull them back onto an area where you might have one area where you just let continue to grow. You have a lot more buildup of biomass and accumulation. And then that can be the area where you move the cattle during a particular rainy time period. So the last thing I would note is that it's still important to me to be able to monitor and to keep cattle off during an extended period of time. And primarily that's because of seed placement. So, whenever we're coming into a cover crop field that's been grazed, where we have some hoof action, one of our issues, of course, is if we're going to plant a soybean seed, 3/4 of an inch, inch and a half deep, something like that. That's where that hoof action does have an impact in terms of seed placement. So it's still something that that we have to pay attention to pretty closely. The other thing is that even though I just described the fact that being able to graze essentially has no impact on bulk density and soil organic matter buildup, et cetera, don't let that information push you into bad decisions or a bad grazing. So it's still very smart to practice rotational grazing. Still very smart to keep your cattle off of the fields in wet periods or during extended amounts of time on a particular field. And it's still smart to have a really good watering plan and not, for example, having cattle tracking the exact same path to a watering tank and building compaction in a specific field. So don't let those facts, keep you from having a really good plan put in place. In terms of management of the cover crops for grazing, it's hard sometimes to be able to give very specific recommendations because I think cover crops are very specific to an individual grower and their farm, their individual fields. But generally speaking, if possible, practice rotational grazing. And when you're out speaking with growers, the first thing when you say rotational grazing, maybe not the first thing, but a lot of times what they're going to think of is management intensive grazing and grazing strips. And so then they start thinking of moving wire every day or every 2 days, and that's could be a roadblock. So I want to encourage you to think of rotational grazing as something that is step by step, where you can move from rotating between fields, and then maybe over time getting to that point where you see the value of being able to practice intensive grazing and moving strip by strip. So just again, as an example, on our farm, and we might be unique in the fact that we have a lot of smaller size fields. But for example, last fall on one of our farms, we've got 4 different fields with cereal rye to be grazed, 20 acres, 31 acres, 42 acres, et cetera. And so what we'll do is we will manage the number of days that they're on that field based upon the size of the field and keep them moving, rotating throughout. We'll actually start grazing pretty early. So even when the cereal rye is only 4 or 5 inches tall, because pretty quickly in the spring, that rye puts on a lot of biomass quickly, and you can get to a point where the forage quality is not as good. Now, whenever we think about grazing of cover crops, sometimes if you're trying to maximize that grazing potential, you'll approach things slightly differently. And one of the first areas to think of is seeding rate. So with some of the grasses that we'll talk about in just a second, you could end up essentially almost doubling the seeding rate. If you have a legume in a mix, or if you're using a legume, like for example, like a clover, you might increase the seeding rate, but not by as much. And the one set of cover crops which we typically don't necessarily increase the seeding rate on is the brassicas. And so that would be things like turnips, radishes, or canola. Again, when you think about seeding rate, or just as an example, and I'll use cereal rye again as an example. If you were primarily planting cereal rye for soil erosion purposes, you might only plant 40, 45 pounds per acre, something like that. If you're wanting to graze it and try to maximize the leaf issue, the leaf area, you might increase that seeding rate, for example, to 75 or 80 pounds per acre. I do want to note that you have to keep in mind what you're trying to accomplish in your individual fields. So, for example, on our farm, where a lot of my focus is on weed control and then also soil erosion and building soil organic matter, I can accomplish those needs and also get some grazing potential by still having a lower seeding rate. So I'm still only seeding in that 40 to 45 pounds per acre range with cereal rye. Now, my circumstances are unique, and so I think when you're speaking to a group or to an individual grower, you really have to get down to the specifics of that grower's needs on that particular field. So in our case, on this one farm, we have two different farms. I have more acres of cover crops than I have cattle. And so I can afford to plant a lower seeding rate, which is going to actually produce me plenty of biomass from a grazing perspective. But I do know that by having a lower seeding rate, I'm probably going to get more stems, which is going to actually lower my forage quality a little bit. But in my particular case, that's still going to work out. So I keep my seeding costs down, and I also accomplish everything I want to in terms of weed control, soil erosion, as well as the ability to be able to graze and extend my growing season. From a fertility perspective, typically we would think that adding fertility specific for grazing is not necessarily worth the investment. I would say though that I have some experience. Once in a while I have some beans on beans in our rotation. I'll come in with a little bit of 1846-0 and some 60, and it's pretty amazing when you see some P and some K put on that field, how it really greens up that cover crop from a grazing perspective. But if it's just specifically for grazing purposes, wouldn't necessarily think that it's worth that investment. So there's also some things that we can do to help maximize the potential for grazing, essentially through extending our season. And you can see 5 different options which are noted here. So I actually only have experience with 3 of those. And so I'll just kind of relate to you some of my personal experiences in terms of how we've used that. So I have flown on cover crops. I've actually switched and used some earlier maturing cash crops. And then I've also planted green. So flying on cover crops, some of the benefits that we might want to see, for example, from an oilseed radish would be being able to take advantage of that deeper tap root to be able to break up a plowpan, discpan, or fragipan. But to be able to get that benefit, you're going to want to have that cover crop planted earlier in the season, which in a lot of cases with a Midwest rotation is going to mean that we're going to need to fly that on. The other scenario, which I can think of, have not necessarily used on our farm, is I've heard some growers, specifically in the state of Indiana, where they've made really nice use of ryegrass and the ability to be able to graze that, and being able to get that flown on a little bit earlier to get some fall growth really helps to extend that growing season. I'd already mentioned the fact that from an earlier maturing cash crop, one of the things that we have found is that incorporating shorter season corn into our rotation has been a benefit. You might think it's going to be a lower yielding crop, but at least on our soils where we're water limited, year in, year out, it actually performs fairly well relative to the 112, 114 day corn, and almost always guarantees the fact that I'm going to be able to be harvesting almost dry corn middle of September, and it enables me that opportunity to be able to then plant that cover crop the 3rd, 4th week of September, and pretty much ensures the fact that I'm going to have some fall grazing versus having to wait till the following spring. And the last thing that we've done for the last 2 seasons on our farm is to plant green. And it does extend your ability to be able to graze that cover crop. So on our farm, after corn, every acre either gets cereal rye as a single species or gets a cereal rye mix, which could be something like oats. It could be something like an oilseed rape that goes on there. And then we will wait to be able to terminate. We'll actually plant into the standing rye and then terminate afterwards. Of course, everyone on here that knows rye in terms of when it bolts up and then pollinates, that the carbon to nitrogen ratio increases significantly and forage quality goes down. But you do have the opportunity to be able to extend the growing season by doing that. Okay, so as that gives you a little bit of an idea in terms of managing cover crops for grazing specifically as a way to be able to maximize that potential. So now we're kind of to that point of, what do you want to do in terms of picking a specific cover crop? And if we're focusing in on looking at the potential for grazing, we're going to be looking at a species where you've got high forage quality or high nutrient value. You're also looking for the amount of biomass that it's going to be able to produce. And in the case of grazing, you also want to be specific into looking at that regrazing potential. So I would very much encourage you to be able to utilize some of the resources which are out there, such as the cover crop species selector from the Midwest Cover Crops Council. And that'll give you some ideas about which cover crop might be most advantageous for you. So let me stop there though, and just remind you that when we're selecting cover crops, sometimes there's dual purposes, right? So a lot of times you might move into thinking about the use of cover crops because you have a need on a specific field. It might be to increase soil organic matter. It might be that you have soil erosion issues. On our particular farm, I have some issues with mare's tail in terms of glyphosate-resistant mare's tail. And what I found is that if I get cover crops, and specifically cereal rye, seeded in the fall, that next spring, I'm not going to have a mare's tail issue. And it's really been able to help me, cut back in terms of some of the chemistry that I've used in terms of herbicide, whether it's a burn down or whether it's a post-emerge application. So there's also this balance back and forth between what you select in terms of what you need to do for that particular field and any kind of need that you have on the field versus balancing that with what your needs are from a grazing perspective in your operation. So that's really important that when you're speaking with a group and very much so when you're speaking with an individual grower to understand their goals. Are they trying to maximize that grazing potential and then get some side benefits for the field? Or are they really trying to impact their field for a specific purpose and then get a little bit of grazing potential on the side? One of the ways I think that you can help balance out those needs of a particular grower is to look at the use of mixes. So whenever you're looking at mixes, it does reduce the risk of failure. I know from speaking with growers that use oilseed radish, for example, many cases they've found, and I've seen it in various plots, where the oilseed radish as a single species maybe doesn't do as good as an oilseed radish mix with a grass, with an oat or with a rye, something like that. So you actually have that better potential to be able to reduce risk. You also have the ability to be able to increase your animal nutrition, incorporating a legume, for example, with a cool season grass. And then also you are able to extend that grazing window by having a mix. And so you've got the potential for having a couple of species where you might have one that has more fall production and one that does better in the spring. Just as an easy example of that, with cool season grasses, you might be able to mix rye, cereal rye, with some oats, where the oats might have a little bit more fall growth. They would not tolerate frost during the winter. And then the following spring, you'd be able to have the cereal rye put on a lot of biomass in the spring for grazing. And so this just gives you an idea of some of the potential gains. This is work from the University of Missouri, Rob Kallenbach, and I just think shows you some of the potential there from a forage quality standpoint and also in terms of the average daily gain. Okay, so we're going to run through now some of the options that you would have. And again, I would rely heavily upon some of the work that's already been done and some of the resources which are out there in terms of the Midwest Cover Crops Council. But we look at grass options, cool season specifically, rye, winter wheat, triticale, barley, oats. I have most of my experience with cereal rye and winter wheat. These are really low risk, easy to implement options for growers. Also, I like the concept of cereal rye mixed with oats, again, where you can get some of that fall growth with oats, and then the rye really takes off in the spring. And annual ryegrass also provides that opportunity to be able to have some nice fall growth. Again, making sure that you get that seeded early enough to be able to get that fall growth is really important. Also, some warm season options that you would have, corn, your sorghum, sorghum sudan grass, as well as pearl millet. We'll talk in a few minutes about some of the issues that you might want to watch out for, such as prusic acid. So in this particular case, something like pearl millet, which might not be the first thing you think of, does actually have high protein levels and does not have an issue in terms of prusic acid. So I actually have, any experiences I have had has been more with the sorghum or with sorghum sudan grass. And from speaking with growers that use more warm season grasses as an option, they typically point to sorghum sudan grass as one of the most versatile options that you have in terms of being able to be regrazed, could also be stockpiled, and puts on quite a little bit of biomass in terms of tonnage. Brassicas is one of the things that I found when talking with growers that if they don't have experience with cover crops, it's not what they think of first. But then after you start incorporating them, and specifically with individuals that are grazing, they find that they really like incorporating some brassicas into their mix. They can be really high yielding. Some will overwinter as well, and we have quite a few options that we can look at that provide grazing opportunities. So this just gives you some of the options which are out there: forage radish, turnips. A lot of growers I have spoken to that have incorporated brassicas really like a mix that includes turnips from a grazing opportunity. Canola is probably one of those things that you don't necessarily think of right off the bat as a potential crop to be able to graze. I was actually, I'll digress a second with a personal experience, was actually at a U.S. Canola Association meeting and listened to Dr. Hancock from Georgia present. And what Dr. Hancock was working to do is he was wanting to see whether you could graze winter canola in the fall and then have it over winter and then still harvest it as an economic crop the next spring, early summer. So essentially to do the exact same thing that we see in the Great Plains with winter wheat. So when I saw some of the quality numbers in terms of protein levels of the grazing of the winter canola, the light bulb went off as something that I wanted to try on our farm, and we have for a couple of seasons. So how we integrate winter canola, it is a brassica. It does need to be planted a little bit earlier in the fall window to be able to get the benefit out of it. And so for us, where we're located in central Missouri, that means that I really preferably like to have it seeded, by that second, third week of September. So it integrates into our operation using short season corn. So 102-day corn typically being harvested around the 15th of September, right back in with winter canola being seeded. Please note that we use an open pollinated variety. So a lot of the seed that's available in the marketplace is going to be a hybrid, or it's going to be, for example, a Roundup Ready or a glyphosate resistant variety. And so we want to be really cautious about using that because you don't want your cover crop to become a weed in the following cash crop. So I use an open pollinated variety and then get that seeded in mid-September, get some nice growth going into the fall. And then the way that we'll rotate our cattle through the various options, we'll have them graze some fescue regrowth. Once we get a little bit of fall growth on a couple of fields of rye, we'll graze rye in the fall. And then after a hard freeze, we'll be able to bring them into the winter canola fields. And that allows us to essentially have grazing from September, October, all the way through December, and not really have to worry about too much in the hay situation until January. I would note that the first time that we tried this, it took the cows a few days to actually know what they had. But once they started grazing, they just stood on their heads. And when we went to rotate them off of that, it was actually not quite easy to move them off of the canola. The other thing I would note is that because of that protein level, a lot of times we'll want to add some roughage into the diet. And so we will just put a fescue bale or something like that out in the field so they can get a little bit more roughage along with the canola that they're grazing. Legumes are another option that you have out there as a high quality option. Very great forage quality. Just know that they're a little bit slow to regrow. My experience is primarily with clovers, red clover, crimson clover. From a grazing perspective, it's been mostly with red clover. So they are slow to grow in the fall, and they're not necessarily going to tolerate heavy grazing. So we're primarily using something like that in a mix. This just gives you an idea of some of those options that are out there. Again, red clover, crimson clover, white clover can actually tolerate a little bit more from a grazing perspective. The bursting clover, I don't have a lot of experience with, but it's not as winter hardy necessarily, at least in our particular area. And the one I'd like to try, which I haven't yet, is a Balenza clover. So a lot of biomass production, cold hardy, and also has hollow stems. And so as it gets closer to maturity, the forage quality doesn't necessarily go down as much. So it's one that I'm excited to be able to try in the future. Are quite a few other options that we have out there. Again, on the legume option, cool season, Austrian winter peas, hairy vetch, common vetch, as well as some medics. A lot of times you'll see these put into mixes. And then we also have some warm season options out there as well, such as sun hip, soybeans, cowpeas, and mung beans. Sun hip is one of those which I think is interesting. Primarily, we've seen this in plots versus grazing full fields of it. It is fast growing though, and whenever it's younger, it has some really nice quality, and it will, if it's just lightly grazed, it will actually regrow. So you've got some opportunities there as well. The last thing that I'm going to mention in terms of some options out there to be used for grazing are some other broadleaf options, but I will say that, at least from my perspective, I think you're going to see these in mixes primarily and in lower amounts, because from a grazing so they're going to have opportunities and good benefits, but from a grazing perspective and a palatability perspective, may not be as good of an option as some of the other things which I've already mentioned. And so this would be things like oilseed sunflowers, flax, buckwheat, and safflower. So primarily just in low levels and primarily used in mixes only. Okay, so I had mentioned a couple of things that we need to always be cautious of or aware of. I'm going to kind of group these things together in terms of nitrates as well as prusic acid. And our strategy for both is actually pretty similar. So with nitrates, you'll potentially see the buildup of nitrates in the stems of some plants. Whenever we're going to have concern would be, for example, right after a frost or whenever the plants are stressed from drought. So in terms of strategies, using mixtures is always a good way to be able to minimize the potential issues. Not grazing for at least 5 days after a frost or a killing frost is important, and kind of use the same technique in case you're coming out of a drought or you have drought stressed plants. And then you can also, with a little bit more management, you can also manage, because as I said, nitrates accumulate typically in the stems. And so just grazing the tops and keeping your cattle rotated is an option. You know, as a kid, I was, we had a lot of milo. And so prusic acid was probably more of the concern that we had at that point in time. Your strategies are similar to that of nitrates, but keep in mind that prusic acid buildup is just kind of the opposite of nitrates, and you'll see prusic acid buildup in the leaves. So in addition to avoiding grazing for at least 5 days after a frost or whenever the plants are drought stressed, the other thing would be is to wait until that plant is at least a couple of feet tall before you would graze to be able to kind of minimize. And the last thing, of course, is you've always got testing options to be able to ensure that you don't have an issue. Okay, so you know, we've talked a little bit about the basics in terms of the compaction question, dealing with fencing, watering, some of the basic management. We've talked a little bit about what you can do in terms of seeding rate to be able to maximize grazing potential, or ways that you can extend your grazing season. And as you gain more and more experience, one of the things I think that you'll find is that growers will then start to think about, how can I potentially modify my operation to be able to enhance profit, to be able to diversify and reduce my risk a little bit better. And I can potentially accomplish that through the integration of more cover crops and more grazing, or more integration of livestock. The easiest way to see that is to avoid what I call the summer slump. And for a lot of us, at least where I'm at, we have a lot of fescue pastures, and we hit that late summer when we just don't have any production. And so being able to have a warm season grass, for example, as an option, some sorghum sudan grass or something like that, sun hemp, to be able to really fill that summer slump. And anything, of course, that we can do in terms of stockpiling of forage and biomass to be able to avoid having to bale hay, I think economically makes sense to us. The other thing which I think is interesting as we gain more experience is we start thinking about our operations slightly differently. So I had mentioned at the very beginning that we're primarily a corn soybean rotation on our farm, but historically we've had winter wheat as a third commodity. And I think there's a lot of producers that would like to continue to look at diversification, but it's just the economics take over in terms of the profit potential of winter wheat, you know, followed by, in our area, double crop soybeans, which may or may not be a good choice economically, depending upon when those soybeans are planted after wheat. Are we talking the second or third week of June, or are we talking the first week of July? So as you get experience with cover crops, you have this opportunity to look at this slightly differently in terms of the ability to be able to plant winter wheat, harvest it, and then plant a cover crop and get great grazing potential and then being able to integrate your cattle or sheep more into your operation and more from a revenue perspective. So I think this is where it kind of gets neat as we gain experience with covers. And it not only helps us in terms of our farming operation with fixing some of our issues in terms of soil organic matter or erosion, but also starts allowing us to look at our operations slightly differently in terms of the integration of livestock. So now we're kind of getting into the meat of my area of focus and what I actually enjoy speaking about. I'm an economist by training, and that is the grazing of cover crops. And I know that we don't have time left in terms of our time here together for presentation. I would say, though, that whenever we're thinking about the economics of grazing cover crops, there's some obvious factors out there, right? You've got the cost of cover crop seed, you've got the cost of sowing or planting that particular cover crop. And then if you're in a situation where you do need some fencing or some water, there's some capital expense up front that you would have to have. You know, make sure when you're working with growers that you remind them of the fact that capital expense, you know, should be depreciated out, because you should have a lifespan for the use of those particular assets. After that, though, I think it's important, you know, to be able to really be honest with yourself in terms of the economics. First, are we a cow-calf operation, or are we running, you know, some heifers and steers in the fall to take advantage of some extra forage that we have? You know, if we're looking at some heifers and steers, maybe some stockers, we're really thinking about forage quality, and we're thinking about weight in, weight out. If we're a cow-calf operation, we are primarily getting our savings because of the fact that we don't have to put up as much hay, and we don't have to feed as much hay during the winter, and or we don't have to buy as much hay. So as you're assessing what the economics look like for you, you need to think, am I planning to fall graze or spring graze? Or do I think I can do both? Because that's going to have an impact on how many inches of cover crop is available, and i.e. how many pounds of biomass is available. If you're rotating through fields versus intensively grazing, you have to be honest with yourself in terms of how much of that biomass is going to be selectively grazed and or, you know, destroyed through hoof action. Or in my case, I don't want to utilize all the biomass through grazing because I want to make sure I have enough residue left for my no-till soybeans afterwards, after cereal rye as an example. So these are all the factors, I think, which are important to be able to consider. It's also, what's the dry matter content of your hay? What's the value of your hay? How much hay do you think you lose in the rack? And also, don't forget about the amount of time it takes to put out hay in the wintertime, and fuel and depreciation on that tractor. So there's a lot of factors that go into this thinking. This is just one example. I'm going to go through 2 or 3 examples of the potential returns of using cover crops from grazing. This is one that I've actually had personal experience with in terms of developing. This is through the SAREC Cover Crop Economics Bulletin. And essentially, in this particular case, we're looking at cereal rye, spring grazing, about 1,500 pounds of dry matter available per acre, which actually isn't that much necessarily, just a few inches for that perspective. We're estimating that we lose about half of it due to hoof action or selective grazing. And you can see some of the other assumptions there that we put into that particular economic analysis. Hay valued at only about $80 a ton, and altogether savings of about $50 per acre. So if you think about the cost of seed and the cost of seeding for a single species cover crop like cereal rye, even before considering benefits in terms of less herbicides, the long-term benefits of increased soil organic matter, increased water infiltration, just on grazing alone, I think that you more than offset the annual cost of seeding a cover crop by grazing. So here's just a few other examples. This is from the Practical Farmers of Iowa. I think the main thing that I want to convey, and these are all great examples, personal experiences from farmers. I think the main thing to convey is that every grower's experience is different in terms of their operation and how they're integrating covers and what their livestock operation looks like. But you can see some pretty impressive numbers there in terms of the potential benefit from grazing on a per acre basis. And again, just a couple of other examples here, one from North Dakota and one from Minnesota. I think These are interesting and intriguing to me because a lot of times I come at this from a cow-calf operator's perspective. And so I'm looking at the amount of hay, which I don't have to feed. And in these particular examples where you see some really nice benefits on a per acre basis, they're looking at it more from a forage quality and from an average daily gain. So how many pounds am I sticking on those steers in this particular case? So really kind of finishing up here, if you're in a scenario where you have ground, but you don't have cattle, or vice versa, you have cattle, but you don't have a lot of additional acres, that does not mean that you can't necessarily take advantage of the opportunities or the potential to be able to utilize and graze cover crops. And you can do that through leasing options. I think the most important thing to remember about leasing, though, is get everything that you can covered up front in terms of the details. So, and it's not just about the cost of the cover crop seed and who's going to establish it. It's not just about fencing and who's going to maintain that fencing. It's also about some of those things, such as what happens during wet periods. Who has control of saying that I want the cows on or off during extended times, or are there clauses about moving them to a sacrifice field? If you're renting by the acre, do you want limits in terms of the number of cows that or sheep that you would have on your particular acres? And what if you, as an operator like myself, don't want all that biomass removed because you want to ensure that you've got cover for the following no-till crop to limit evapotranspiration losses? So just when you're looking into a scenario like this, just ensure that you have a lot of these things thought through and into that leasing arrangement. So there are multiple ways. I certainly wouldn't call myself an expert in terms of what those leasing options are. It could be just on a per acre fee, which is the way that, at least where I'm at, a lot of pasture is rented on a per acre basis. It could be, for example, if you're running some fall stalkers, it could be a type of fee setup on a per pound of gain or performance. And one of the things I would encourage you to look at, especially where you've got some nice higher quality forage cover crops that you're using, is to consider a different method, something like the example that you're seeing here in terms of pasture quality factors that you can implement. So essentially, this is an incorporation of the size of the animals that you're putting on in terms of an animal equivalent, the market value of hay, and then assigning a quality factor to the forages that you have. And with cover crops and the forage quality, with legumes and whatever, even rye or oats or younger, it's a pretty nice high quality forage. So the potential to use something like this as an option to be able to be equitable, both for you, if you're the row crop operator with the cover crops, as well as for the livestock producer. And now just to kind of finish up, just a couple of things that get overlooked in terms of the use of cover crops and from a grazing perspective. As you're coming through the winter, I'd already mentioned the fact that I really feel like that, from a frame perspective, our cows look a lot better. Also from a calving perspective, you've got a lot less mud to deal with, a lot less potential maybe for disease, and just some higher quality forage for lactating cows. And then one other thing, which I have not necessarily had to deal with as much, but I've definitely heard stories from some growers that are no-till and using cover crops, and that's specifically with slugs and voles. So we haven't had a slug issue on our farm per se. I've had a little bit of a vole issue. Having more residue actually tends to make that issue a little bit more. And so if we are grazing, removing some of that biomass, we could potentially bring down some of those potential issues that we're dealing with. And then finally, and then happy to take any questions that you may have that have come up in the chat. Just as we think about grazing of cover crops, I describe it this way. To me, it's a slam dunk from an economic perspective. When we think about all the long-term benefits that we get from using cover crops, the fact that we can integrate our livestock operation from a grazing perspective, I think offsets any annual cost that we have and allows us to really accumulate some of those other long-term benefits. In addition to, in our case, for example, we're also receiving some benefits in terms of reduced herbicide use as well. I think that a lot of times you can start simple and then gain experience. And as you gain experience, you'll understand where economically it makes sense to make things a little more complicated per se. But when you're talking with growers, make sure that you help them understand that they can start off simple. The other thing that I really appreciate is the fact that grazing to me is just an added benefit. We still get all of those soil health benefits that we want: increased aggregate structure, increased water infiltration, building of soil organic matter. The bulk densities tend to stay the same whether we're grazing or not grazing. So we get all these benefits of the use of cover crops. In my case, I have been out on my hands and knees looking at weed control. So looking at mare's tail, looking at other potential issues where I have grazed cover crops and where I have not grazed cover crops, and just marking out a 3x3 square and actually counting the amount of weeds which are present. I've actually gone in and I've double grazed. So I've actually grazed fields twice and grazed them pretty hard. And I still see those weed control benefits specifically from using cereal rye. So I feel like that we get those benefits whether we graze or whether we don't. And the last thing is that I think that as we gain experience, it does help us to understand how we might make changes to our operation, better integrating in the livestock operation with crops to be able to increase our profit potential. And just, I guess the last thing I would say, more from the perspective of when you're providing this information to growers and to livestock producers is throughout, take advantage of the audience that you have and their experiences. And so, for example, when we're talking about the various options for cover crop species, whether it's a cool season grass, whether it's a legume or a brassica, that's a great place to be able to stop and then get the audience interaction to allow them to say the different types of mixes or the different types of single species that they have used on their operation. And once you get that interaction going back and forth, I think you'll be amazed with the cross-pollination of ideas that you'll see. So let me stop at that point in time. I've enjoyed being with you this morning. Maybe went a few minutes long, but hopefully I addressed some of the questions that you may have. So Nicole, I will.
Thank you so much, Alan. We actually do have a couple, well, we have one question in the chat other than will this information be posted? So it will be posted, everyone. You were asked, do you have a favorite cover crop mix for fall and spring grazing?
Yeah, so I'll just tell you some of the mixes and or species that we've used. So every acre of corn on our farm after corn harvest gets cereal rye. It is low risk. It is mistake proof almost. It's one of the simplest things to be able to try. So whether you seed it early and get fall growth, whether you seed it late, I have for various reasons not got it in seed until late October, and so you don't necessarily get the soil erosion benefits, and it doesn't look like there's anything there. And the following spring, you've got grazing potential. It's always there. I have seen our neighbors, they have an organic operation and they graze a lot of sheep. I have seen them graze cereal rye in the fall to the point where I thought they had taken it up by the roots. And that's not really what you want to do, by the way. But amazingly, they take a few animals off there and it's right back growing. So cereal rye on all acres. I usually incorporate where I have some potential of soybean cyst nematode. I'll incorporate some oilseed rape, just as the potential for a trap crop. I also like the opportunity to seed in some oats to be able to ensure I have some fall growth. I like winter canola. I know it's unusual, and sometimes it doesn't work out because to get the benefit from it, you really need to get it in our area. It really needs to be seeded around the middle of September. But that is a wonderful opportunity after a hard frost to have a great high quality forage to be able to feed. And just make sure that you plant open pollinated seed to ensure the fact that you can then not turn it into a weed in your operation. I've had more difficulty incorporating legumes, but if you can to make it work. So for example, if I do have some wheat and I have the opportunity to even to have a stubble crop of red clover, and then the following spring, it's a great forage for the cows. So.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody want to unmute? Well, I can ask a quick one until somebody unmutes themselves. On my cash crop family farm, we just started cover cropping because I started at the Midwest Cover Crop Council and got very insistent about the use of cover crops on our farm. So they finally let in. We're doing some cover cropping on top of our winter wheat, but we're just a small cash crop operation and have never leased land out before. But how, like, on a scale of like beginner to expert cover cropper and graze, or do you think grazing your cover crops is like a beginner level practice, or is that more when you're established into the practice? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't necessarily. Again, I kind of approach it that you can just start simple, and the way to limit your risk is just to either with your own livestock or whether it's through a lease, just have a very short period of time, just minimize your risk. Even if you only have some cattle on some sure rye for 30 days, they're getting a great benefit, and you're not necessarily having issues in terms of hoof action or anything like that. So I don't consider it to be something you have to wait until you've got years of experience.
Awesome, thank you. And I'll just open it to the audience one more time. Anybody have any burning questions you want to ask Alan? You can unmute or type in the chat.
We just had one pop up in the chat. How many acres are you running cattle on, Alan?
Oh, in today's standards, we're probably we're maybe just a mid-sized farm. So the whole farm is about 875 acres, and we are row cropping less than half of that. And so the rest of it is timber, pasture, and hay.
Well, that concludes our modules then. So thank you everyone for being on today, and thanks again to Alan.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Bye, everyone.